check the stream. Looks okay. And now you should get it okay. All right. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Very good. Welcome to you, and welcome also to the viewers attending the Satsang online. We have a lot of great questions here. We'll start with some online questions, and we'll also take questions from our local ashram students. Everything here looks good. Yep, looks fine. Okay, first question is from Maya, who lives in Singapore. She asks, in the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna says we should give up doer-ship and enjoyer-ship. Does it mean you should give up doing things like studying Vedanta? Doing and enjoying things like cooking and eating your food? So this is a very common mistake, because Sri Krishna indeed talks about overcoming kartritva and bhoktritva are the Sanskrit terms. Kartritva, the status of being an agent of action, and bhoktritva, the status of being an experiencer. And he says in Bhagavad Gita and all Vedantic texts say that you come out of that status of being an agent and an enjoyer. But then Maya's concern is, but does it mean that I should give up studying Bhagavad Gita? Should I give up hobbies? Should I give up cooking, etc., etc.? She plays sitar, so should she give up playing sitar? Absolutely not. The misunderstanding here is when Sri Krishna says you overcome being, you are no longer a doer or enjoyer. He's talking about after you get enlightened. That's not a practice. You don't practice giving up agency. You don't practice giving up being an experiencer. That's a point of arrival. Can you practice being enlightened? Try it for the next 5 minutes. You get my point. I'm being silly. That's not a matter of practice. So in the Bhagavad Gita, there are a great many kinds of spiritual practice discussed, but giving up agency and being an experiencer, these are not spiritual practices. This is where you arrive at through your practice of Vedanta. Okay. Next question from Patrick, who lives in Kentucky. He says, in your own personal experience, does nididhyasana, the process of assimilation, have a culmination? Or is it an ongoing process that continues indefinitely? And this is actually a question that requires a rather nuanced answer. First of all, let's be very clear that nididhyasana is, in general, a process of assimilation that takes place after you've reached that point of arrival, after you've gained enlightenment, in the sense that after you have discovered your true self, Atma, is not an agent of action, nor an experiencer of objects. This is the discovery with a capital T that's made in Advaita Vedanta. It's made as a result of the practice of Atma Vichara, self-inquiry, a process which is guided by the teachings of Advaita Vedanta. So, through your practice of self-inquiry, Atma Vichara, guided by the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, one day you reach the threshold of a discovery. The discovery that my true nature, as Satchidananda Atma, as pure consciousness, is not an agent of action or an experiencer of objects. So that is step one. That's a big step. If we call that step one, it's a very big step. Of course, it's preceded by preparation and lots of spiritual practice, including meditation, bhakti, and all the rest. Nididhyasana picks up from that point, and its role is, we use the English word assimilation, but like any English word, it doesn't capture the essence of the Sanskrit I'll come to in just a moment. First of all, the issue to be addressed through the practice of nididhyasana is your mind and brain are not capable of instantaneous transformation. Remember, and this is one thing we have to be thankful about for living in modern times, when neuroscience has shown us so clearly that the mind is a product of the brain, and the brain is chemistry. Chemical reactions don't take place instantaneously. So for the brain, after making that discovery that I referred to just a moment ago, the brain and mind are unable to instantaneously change. So therefore we say there's a process of assimilation that takes place. There is an old-fashioned metaphor. When I say old-fashioned, not old-fashioned in a ancient Indian sense, but old-fashioned in a modern Western sense. Do you remember those Polaroid cameras that used to have the self-developing film? You go click, and then zzzt, the film gets ejected. But when you went click, the image was captured. When you make the discovery, you've made the discovery. But when you look at that picture that's been spit out from your camera, it's just white. It takes time for it to be developed. And that metaphorically suggests the process of assimilation that takes place after that discovery. Now, the more nuanced understanding comes in when, and this is a little more technical, many of you have heard this discussion before, that the primary purpose of nididhyasana, using Sanskrit terminology, is to remove viparita bhavana, or dehatma buddhi, habitual identification with your body and mind. So, from a very simplistic standpoint, we call it assimilation, and it is a process of assimilation. But looking at things a little bit more carefully, that process of assimilation is required because of the mind's habitual identification with the body and mind. So at a more detailed level, nididhyasana is the gradual removal of that habitual identification. Now we're ready to answer Patrick's question. Is nididhyasana, does it have a culmination, or is it an ongoing process? Well, if you look at it as assimilation, you might say, when that picture comes out of your Polaroid camera, when is it fully developed? That's tricky, right? So it's a gradual process. Some of you remember in a math class this exponential curve. Actually, I should do it this way. So it develops like this. At first it develops very quickly, and then more slowly and more slowly, approaching the point of completely being developed. But remember that they use that term, you approach it asymptotically, what fancy mathematical terms, which means gradually but never quite reaching that state of perfection. And there's the point here is that if we look at nididhyasana through the lens of that word assimilation, which again is the English word, not the Sanskrit expression, it suggests an ongoing process that never reaches completion, and it never reaches completion for a good reason. When will your mind reach a state of perfection? About the same time your body reaches a state of perfection. So you get the point that our physical body and our minds, being very human and limited, are incapable of reaching a state of perfection. So from that standpoint of assimilation, it is endless. But set that English word aside. I'm trying to think. I'm thinking, what is the Sanskrit as equivalent for assimilation? And nothing pops into my mind suggesting that it's kind of a foreign concept. It's a valid concept, it's an important concept, but it's not exactly what Shankaracharya and all of his followers taught. They were focused on the removal of dehatma buddhi, this habitual identification with the body and mind. Now we get a very different answer. When is dehatma buddhi removed? Well, suppose in a given moment of time, it's not present. If it's not present, think about an enlightened person who, at the very moment, is free from dehatma buddhi. They had some dehatma buddhi, habitual identification, body-mind. Yesterday they had some. Today, not much. Tomorrow, we'll see. So now, what do you say about nididhyasana? When the problem is absent, you don't even need to do nididhyasana. When and if that habitual identification with the body and mind arises, then you can practice nididhyasana. So notice how different the interpretation becomes when we give up this English-based approach based on the word assimilation and substitute a more Sanskritic, more traditional approach. You get a very different perspective, which is why we, if you wonder why do we put so much emphasis on studying things in the original Sanskrit language, this perhaps is a good example. Because if you never look at the Sanskrit, you won't see the word dehatma buddhi. You won't see this viparita bhavana. You'll be reading English translations that always talk about assimilation. Anyway, enough said. Okay, another question here from Arun. Arun lives in Bangalore. Recently, a court in India, there has been a landmark judgment which allowed passive euthanasia of a 37-year-old man who spent 13 years in a vegetative state due to a brain injury. So we've had court cases like that in this country as well. What to do when somebody is in a vegetative state, they're connected to all these machines. Well, even if they're not connected to machines, they have a feeding tube. They need to be given food and water. They're unable to feed themselves. So even if there are no other machines connected, as a minimum, they're receiving food and water. And I think what this path of euthanasia is referring to is stopping the feeding of that patient to allow the patient to die more naturally, we might say. But now here we look at it from is that passive euthanasia allows life support to be withdrawn from the person to allow the person to pass away with dignity. And that's exactly the idea. But now from the Hindu standpoint, it's widely believed that suffering reduces our karmic debt by way of the exhaustion of papa karmas. Correct. That's exactly what the doctrine of karma says. That when you're laying in bed feeling miserable, there's one good consequence. And that is, you are exhausting papa karmas, which means you won't have to worry about them in the future. Whatever papa karmas you exhaust now, finished. So, but now, what is the dharmic view of this passive euthanasia, removing the feeding tube from a patient who is in a vegetative state? And this is a little more complex than you might think. First of all, really complex. Let's take the simple case first. If vegetative state means brain dead, then the patient is having no experience whatsoever, no suffering. If the patient is not having any experience, they're not undergoing suffering, which means they're not exhausting karmas. On the other hand, continuing to feed this patient is causing a lot of harm to the family. Think about the poor family who's watching their loved one. 13 years, you said. For 13 years, the family is coping with their loved one dying. Talk about dying a slow death. 13 years. Imagine the immensity of the family's suffering. Also, in a more pragmatic sense, imagine the costs involved in the medical care required for 13 years. So it's absolutely ridiculous from that standpoint to refuse euthanasia in such a case. If the situation is as I described, if the patient is brain dead. Now, suppose the patient is not brain dead. Things get a whole lot more complicated. Your loved one is in a hospital. Exhausting his or her karmas as they lie dying. Now, the doctors talk to you about a medical intervention that could extend the life of your loved one by a week or two at the cost of $100,000, mostly paid by your insurance company. So does that mean if you keep them alive for an extra 2 weeks, they get to get rid of that little bit more papa karma they can exhaust, so they'll be better off in their next life? Factually, that might be true. But everything in life is a trade-off. That is to say that they might be in a better position in their next life. Actually, you have to admit, 2 weeks of extra suffering. They've already undergone so much suffering in life. Put things in perspective. So it's not Now, that extra 2 weeks is not a big deal. What is a big deal is making the family, I'm back to that argument, making the family suffer 2 more weeks. To me, that's the big deal. The family is suffering incredibly. And if when a decision is made to prolong the life of a loved one by 2 weeks, you're prolonging not just the life of your loved one, you're prolonging the suffering of everyone involved. It seems to me, when you weigh all the factors involved, it's best to allow the person to die with dignity. And that's, anyway, what it looks like from my standpoint. Another question here. This question comes from William. William lives in UK. Currently studying in high school. Nice to have a high school student attending these satsangs. However, I notice as I progress spiritually, I find it more difficult to put effort into my studies. I find it less interesting. My mind gravitates towards spiritual practice, as I find it fascinating. Underline that word. I find it fascinating. I feel as though going to college would not be as enjoyable or conducive to further dedication, to spiritual progression, his words, and study. What would you suggest? Well, the obvious answer is that spiritual growth is a long-term project, which means you better be ready for 20, 30 or more years. And if you're a typical person, a few years is not enough. For typical people, decades. Which means William is going to have to support himself for those decades while he pursues enlightenment. And for that purpose, going to college and getting a good education, building a profession would definitely be a good idea. It's really hard. The Western psychologist Maslow made the observation, it's really hard to seek enlightenment when your stomach is empty. It's true. Okay. There's now a little more nuanced response here. When William said, I find spiritual things more fascinating. That fascination will not sustain a lifelong spiritual practice. That fascination wears off. It's like when you get something new, you get a new gadget, you get one of these new ones, and you want to say, oh, what does this one do? How long does that fascination last? Not long, right? So Vedanta is like, it's a fascinating intellectual, I won't call it a toy. This is not a toy. It's a very valuable device. In the same way, Advaita Vedanta is a very valuable spiritual practice. It's easy to get fascinated by this device. It's easy to get fascinated by the teachings of Vedanta. But ultimately, that fascination fades away. So what will sustain someone's pursuit of spiritual growth is not fascination, but a deep-seated desire for enlightenment, inner freedom. Okay, we will take some questions here. Okay, go ahead, please.
So, Swamiji, my understanding is when you are young and when you're growing up, living a daily life, student life, and then into a career life, you come across so many obstacles. And through spirituality only, all the knowledge that you get through Bhagavad Gita and other Vedanta, that you overcome your desires, you overcome your obstacles, and then only slowly you reach a level of spirituality. It's an easier route rather than while you're in high school you feel that it's fascinating towards the spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be more helpful to have a straight life, to have a regular life and go through the studies as well?
A regular life means what?
It means like the student life, the normal life.
So are you suggesting we should tell William, don't study Vedanta?
No, do study Vedanta and while continuing your studies.
That's what we just said, right? That's exactly what I said. Right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So the point I made was that the fascination wears off, and there is a need to go to college, and for pragmatic reasons, at no point did I say that he should not study Vedanta. And it's wonderful when somebody recognizes the value at an early age. That's I think something significant and important. It's a very good thing. Anything you want to follow up on?
Yes.
Okay. Other questions here? Anyone? I'll take your question later. Okay. All right. Let's take some more questions online. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I keep forgetting this one. Good. Next question here. We may keep our session a little shorter today. Next question is from Dave, who also lives in UK, in Leicester. He says, my question is regarding health and how it affects the spiritual journey. Vedanta says that we are neither this body nor this mind, even though we can intellectually understand this. Underline that word intellectually. We're going to come back to that. Even though we can intellectually understand it, and even though we get a glimpse of it in deep meditation, underline that, when you get a cold or a fever, it knocks us out and puts us in serious discomfort. When we feel sick, how are we not able to intellectually get back to the same place where we used to be? Or does that require decades of sadhana? That's a good question from Dave, and it shows a number of common issues, even problems with regard to how we approach Vedanta as a spiritual path. First, Dave himself distinguishes between intellectual appreciation and gaining a glimpse in meditation. So intellectual appreciation, I'm sorry to be a little blunt, is useless. To intellectually appreciate, according to the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, my true nature is pure consciousness, completely independent of this body and mind. That consciousness is unborn, uncreated, unchanging. When this body dies, that consciousness will continue on without any change whatsoever. I understand. Good. What is the joke? That understanding plus $2 will get you a cup of coffee. Used to be a nickel, I think, when they used to tell this. I don't even know. What do you pay for a cup of coffee nowadays? I don't even know. $5. Look at that. So I'm a little dated. I don't go out buying coffee. I still, anyway. So, useless, absolutely useless. Now, he mentions a glimpse during meditation. Need not be during meditation, but the word glimpse is an important word here. Glimpse means it's something you see. Of course, we're not talking about something you see in a physical sense, but it's something you see in a cognitive sense. We use that in all languages. Do you see what I mean? That expression. All languages has a similar expression to that. Do you see what I mean? That expression suggests that there is a deeper kind of cognitive appreciation, which we call seeing. And in this case, the word I used in response to an earlier question was discovery. Through that process of self-inquiry, Atma Vichara, guided by these teachings of Advaita Vedanta, you eventually make a discovery or recognition of who you always have been. This is, by the way, this is such a crucial point in Vedanta. It's discovery of who you already are. You do not become that. You are that. Many of you know these Mahavakyas, the statements from the Upanishad, like Tattvamasi, you are that. The ancient rishis never said you will become that one day. If you're really lucky, if you study a lot and if you do a lot of prayers and a lot of rituals, one day you will become that. They never said. You are that here and now because you always have been that and you always will be that. It's not a matter of becoming. There's no transformation involved. It's a matter of self-recognition, recognition of your true nature. There are a number of I'm not in the mood for telling all these stories today. We'll let that be. Self-recognition. We all grow up identified completely with our bodies and minds. And there comes a point when self-inquiry leads you to discover the error in your conclusions about who I am. So you've been concluding, I am this body, I am this mind, etc. Those are wrong conclusions. The discovery that takes place leads you to recognize the falseness of those wrong conclusions and the truth of your nature as pure consciousness. And then you get sick. We're coming back now to Dave's question. So you're laying in bed feeling really miserable with a cold and flu and all of that. If you have really made that discovery in a very clear, powerful way, you can take your mind back to the moment of discovery. You can recall that discovery. You can see while you're laying in bed, you can see what you saw at the moment of making that discovery. And in that way, you can become free from identification with your body and mind, and then you'll still be laying there with your cold and your body will be aching, but you'll recognize, oh, thank goodness, it's not me. This is a perspective of an enlightened person. The body is ill. Thank goodness, it's not me. Now, I think the issue that Dave is also referring to here is when you're really sick, you're not able to bring your mind back to that discovery. You're not able to recollect that discovery. You're not able to, and I'll use different language, in the present moment, you're not able to detach from your body and mind. You're not able to break the identification with your body and mind in the present moment. Why? Now we're back to an earlier question. Dehatma buddhi, habitual identification with the body and mind. I said before that nididhyasana is following the discovery. So if Dave talks about glimpses in meditation, if it's really a discovery, then Dave needs lots of nididhyasana to remove that habitual identification with the body and mind, so that when you're laying in bed with a terrible flu, you don't lose your way. Even with your mind dulled by illness and dulled by medication, it will still be perfectly clear to you that what happens to the body doesn't affect you as pure consciousness. And just to underline that, definitely your mind can be very much affected by illness, especially illnesses like dementia, and et cetera, et cetera. This goes in a direction of a very complex topic. I want to keep the satsang a little bit short today, so forgive me. I think we're going to leave that alone at this point. Okay, I think we've answered Dave's question fairly well. This question comes from Brandon. Brandon lives in Brooklyn, nearby here in New York. Brandon has a question about the role of psychedelics in spiritual life. Psychedelics is a common expression for psychoactive medications, not the ones that your psychiatrist prescribes, but others like LSD and so forth. And he says he's explored them over time along with his study of Advaita Vedanta. Some experiences have been deeply transformative and have influenced the direction of his life. At the same time, through Vedantic study, I understand that knowledge of the self is not dependent on any particular experience, including psychedelic experiences as a result of these meds. And I increasingly feel that I might be outgrowing reliance on these states. I'm trying to understand their role more clearly. Do psychedelics have any role in preparing the mind for self-inquiry, or are they ultimately a distraction? Okay. You know, this is one of those odd situations. You've asked the right person, because there aren't too many swamis who can say, yeah. I grew up in the 1960s, so that was my culture. And I wasn't immune to experimentation in those days. Based on my experience and based on the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, what we could say is this. At best, psychedelics teach you one lesson. And that lesson is, don't trust your experience as being real. One of the topics we come back to again and again in Advaita Vedanta is our over-reliance on experience as being real. This is me. This is solid. This is real stuff. Well, you take one of these pills and it messes up your mind so badly that your ordinary experiences get completely scrambled. Nothing you experience appears real. It's like living, depending on the kind of med you take, it's like living in some kind of cartoon world where things are just not real. And at best, psychedelics can teach you that lesson. What can psychedelics tell you about Satchidananda Atma? In my experience, absolutely nothing. That's my personal experience, and perhaps somebody else has a different experience, but I don't see any further role for psychedelics in spiritual life. In fact, in order to perform this Atma Vichara, self-inquiry, you need a really clear, strong, focused mind. And all of these substances work against having that kind of clear, focused mind. So all of them would be make it more difficult with regard to self-inquiry, with regard to Atma Vichara. That's based on my personal experience and based on the teachings of Advaita Vedanta. So going back to my earlier comment that at best, psychedelics can tell you that the world is not as real as it seems, but do you really need psychedelics to learn that lesson? If you open up a physics book that tells you objects are made of atoms are almost entirely empty space, isn't that enough? Just, a high school physics book can teach you enough to learn that what you experience in the world is not as real as it seems. So based on that, I would say that even in that particular case, psychedelics could be useful, but certainly not, I would say not advisable. And when I say not advisable, I have to say that because in those days, this would be in the around 1970 to 1973, I suppose, my wild years, as it were, I lost several friends due to either directly or indirectly due to drug use. So it is not a small issue. Now, I'm quite sure that some people watching this satsang will say, wait a minute, such and such a person says he's been using these all of this stuff, ayahuasca and all of this stuff, and they claim they've been enlightened as a result of all of it. I think we should be highly skeptical of such claims. And here's a perspective. When you take a substance, it changes your brain physiologically. Are those changes permanent or not? You end up where you started. I would argue you end up in a worse shape than you started, again, based on my own personal experience. So anyway, I'm sorry for being a little negative on this topic, again, based on my experience in those hippie days. But based, I think, here's a final comment. Self-administered powerful psychedelic drugs is taking a big risk. And I think that's undeniable. And I don't see any need to take such a risk. Everything can be accomplished without it. Yeah, take the microphone, please.
Thank you, Swamiji. Just a follow-up. There is a lot of discussion right now around ibogaine.
About?
Ibogaine, that's similar mushroom, like ayahuasca. There is a big, right now, movement around the U.S. war veterans taking that for addiction. And most of the... Yes.
There might be, and I'm glad you're bringing this up. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, but my comments were specifically about the use of psychoactive agents for the sake of Advaita Vedantic self-inquiry. It may turn out that a lot of these substances can help with addiction and other things. I absolutely don't deny that. Please, go on, please.
Yeah, so that's clearly a benefit.
Yes.
The science is showing that, almost 80% success rate. The reason why I'm bringing this up here is then you hear some of these war veterans talking about it, it almost feels like that they had a glimpse in actually having consciousness, tapped into it. So they talk about now I'm much more connected to my fellow human beings, which is ultimately, is one of the side effects of being part of this, right? That you are part of one, overall consciousness. So people talk about that. So again, that is done in a very, very controlled fashion, not to be done, lightly. But I think there is a lot of science that's basically also supporting that it can help you with, addiction, but that is actually fixing something very deep within your, whether spiritual or however your mind works.
Okay, so the science is that these substances could be helpful in treating addiction, absolutely. There's no science that says it's going to help you get enlightened. Science doesn't go that far. So let's just be a little bit clear. Could there be some other benefits in individual people's lives? No doubt. No doubt. As I said, my experience was of a bunch of reckless kids using these substances in a very dangerous way. If they're done in a controlled or scientifically, in a clinically supervised way, perhaps there's more benefits available. Okay, let's just take one more question, then call it enough for today. Last question comes from Bharati, who also lives in New York. And Bharati says, I'm coming to the end of my maternal responsibilities, which I've taken on with great seriousness and intensity. I'm not sure, do you ever? And the children get married and move on. I don't know if the responsibility has come to an end, but I think Bharati is talking about retirement, which is excellent. As I enter this next phase, I'm curious, what does vanaprastha look like in modern life? Vanaprastha is the Sanskrit term for retired life. I would be specifically, I'm wondering about what kinds of activities would be most aligned at this stage: spiritual practices, scriptural study, service. I'd love to understand what an ideal life might look like at this phase in life. Excellent. Congratulations to Bharati for being able to retire. It's a time of freedom where your day-to-day life is not overwhelmed by other responsibilities. It's great to have that freedom and to be able then to direct your attention to what is most important in your life. Certainly, of the things that are most important, spiritual practice is there. She's already said so. There could be other things that are very important. And here we have to say, what is important to one person might not be so important to another. So largely, the answer to Bharati's question is highly personal. It depends on, she was asking about daily activities and lifestyle. I would say it depends more on Bharati's individual inclinations. But having more time for spiritual practice in general suggests maybe be a little structured about it. Have a period of time in the day set aside for meditation, prayer, scriptural study, any other practice that you like to do. But if you have the freedom to do so, to create a schedule where every day this is your time set aside for your sadhana. And along with that, if you have a certain place set aside for the sadhana, if you have a quiet corner of your house, or if you have an altar or something, it's helpful, just in a very pragmatic way. It's helpful if you have a particular place in your home set aside for spiritual activities, and it's even more helpful if you have a schedule and you set aside a particular period of time. What time is up to you. How long that time would be, again, up to you, but to be a little structured. So anyway, congratulations to Bharati on her retirement. I think this will be a good place to conclude today. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavit Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti 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 Om. Tat Sat. See you next time.